through that community that I did my first open source contribution, because InnerSource Commons itself is an open source project. So then I became an open source contributor. First of all, InnerSource, I would say, is like an evolving practice. So, it's not like there's an exhaustive 5-point list that I can tell you that's it. This is exactly it and no more. But I will say that. But then there are also processes inside internal organizations that make some things harder. So when you think about even the culture that's around a particular project. So, for example, and we run regular surveys to think about what people are perceiving as the benefits. And I mean, one of the case studies I was particularly involved in was actually from Microsoft, and was a really interesting one because.
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast.
Open source is freedom.
Open source is great collaboration.
Open source is good engineering.
Open source is not a business model.
Open source is community.
Open source is interesting.
Open source is the future.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
Yeah, let's start recording. This sounds like fun.
Claire, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself, your tech background, and what do you do now?
I'd love to, and thank you for having me on. So I've been working for all of my career in the tech industry, mostly here in Ireland. Not as a developer, actually. So I started off as a product manager and in some startups here. And in about 2003, I joined Microsoft Ireland first of all, to be working in their, what they later called their developer experience department, but it was essentially doing community outreach to developer and technical audiences. And then I headed up that department from about 2007 or no, maybe 2009. We're counting back now. But I was always involved in reaching out to communities, developer communities, and we had been responsible for getting, helping them to adopt the latest Microsoft technologies. And it was through Microsoft, actually, that I became aware of open source. And certainly in my latter days in Microsoft Ireland, we, in the developer experience group, were very big in terms of promoting how Microsoft had very much changed its stance with regard to open source, and in those later years when I was in Microsoft, were very active in promoting the idea of open source on Azure at the time. And I suppose I had been aware of open source at that period of time, but I'd never really experienced any open source community. So when I left Microsoft in 2017, and at that time I was very interested in actually kind of thinking more about. I had observed that an awful lot of the work that we had done as kind of pilot projects never really got adopted broadly. And I started looking into this idea of how technology gets adopted and organizational trends, and even how technology in general gets built, and thinking more about that kind of organizational and cultural aspect to software development. And around that time, I started working for an organization called Nearform, who are based in the south of Ireland. And that organization was interesting because they were the first group of folks that I worked with that were actively involved in the open source communities. And it was through them that I began to understand a little bit more about, I suppose, the potential for open source more broadly in the corporate sector, and how it was being used. I mean, it really did change my perceptions about open source, just even learning about who they engaged with and how open source was both being used and why it was being created. And also at Nearform, I happened to meet a woman called Denise Cooper, who was one of the founders of the InnerSource Commons community. And InnerSource, of course, is the use of open source methods inside organizations to create proprietary code, often as a pathway to open source, but sometimes just as a way to break down silos and help collaboration. And I was fascinated by how this was actually enabling collaboration, because for me, it came down to the fact that I thought that people were actually pretty bad at collaborating and kind of communicating around technology. I had been working with Denise around this idea of how to enable InnerSource in companies, and became fascinated by just how much open source methods and culture could really change and help organizations. So when I left Nearform, I started working actually with InnerSource Commons, and that was in 2020. Denise asked me to come and start working for the InnerSource Commons community. And I was helping them at that time because two things were happening. First of all, the pandemic. So they had to move all their operations online and virtual. And that was a big shift for them as an organization. But secondly, they were beginning to form as a foundation. So before that, they were just a community, and then they incorporated as a 501c3. I was the executive director then there for 2 years. And it was through that community that I did my first open source contribution, because InnerSource Commons itself is an open source project. So then I became an open source contributor. Mostly in terms of not code. It was in terms of actually adding contributions to the website itself and the knowledge around InnerSource. But it was still incredibly exciting to actually get my first contribution accepted. My first pull request accepted. It was fantastic. And I think it was through that community I met a lot of folks who were involved in open source program offices, and I became more aware of the broader potential for open source to have economic and social impact. So it was from that work that I just gradually found my way into more open source communities where folks were thinking about, in particular, how do we systemize and operationalize the whole idea of open source within organizations, both private sector and then public sector in particular. So in more recent years, I've been working more around open source program offices in the public sector, and particularly in universities and research institutions globally, so mostly in the States, a couple in Europe. And I myself joined the academic community just last year. I decided to start a PhD, and I am currently a researcher with the University of Galway here in Ireland, though I'm based in Dublin. Along the way, I set up Open Ireland Network because I was trying to promote the whole idea of open source in Ireland at a national level. And that's been my later years. So a roundabout path to get to open source, perhaps not as long a history in open source as many people, but I'm delighted to be here. So that's been my journey so far.
When it comes to your first contribution experience, was it a good experience? I mean, the process itself of creating the pull request, submitting it for review, and then going through the whole nitty-gritties of getting it accepted and merged.
Oh, it was, but I was very lucky. So InnerSource Commons is a wonderfully friendly community, and I had been in contact with a person there called Johannes, who basically handheld me through my first pull request. And I have to say, had it not been for his wonderful patience and his help in that, I perhaps wouldn't have been as enthusiastic as I still am around open source. I've heard other people's first time stories, and it maybe wasn't as pleasant. But I mean, Johannes was fantastic. I was so nervous. I was like, what will I type in this box? Does that look okay? And is it that button? Are you sure? Am I ready to go? Okay. And so I was a very nervous first timer in that respect. But it was such a pleasant experience when it worked and it got merged, and I was like, celebrating in the background, do my little dance. I do a little dance every time I get a PR merged, and it was really a fantastic experience. But I really do have to thank Johannes, because I do think that first time makes a big difference in terms of how that works out for people, certainly from hearing other people's experience. But it gave me enough, I suppose, encouragement to help others now. And I think, I think that's the wonderful thing about the open source community. It's you don't even have to be, I suppose, an expert to be able to help people get over sometimes those first steps. And I really like that idea of near peer mentorship, because it just gives the potential for so many people to help others. Johannes, of course, was an expert, so that helped, but he also had the patience to deal with me a first timer. So that was brilliant too. But yeah, it was a fantastic first time experience. And I think I look back on that, and I remember calling up Denise, who had first introduced me to the community, and getting all excited and going, oh my God, this was such an amazing experience. Why doesn't everyone do it? Why is there a problem with like contributions? Because everyone should, you don't have to be a developer. It's amazing. And she was like, hold your horses, Clare. It's not all sunshine and roses. It's not always this easy. But certainly for me, my first time was a great experience. So that helped me sustain my interest in the whole community and see what it could be like, which is fantastic.
I have a very similar experience in terms of like I did have a colleague within Ericsson, and we were starting to do this open source thing together. So I do remember sitting in front of the computer and staring at the screen. I think I was uploading a bug fix or something for review, but I've never done this before, either of us. So we were just sitting there, and then we were like, I was looking at him like, do you think this is how it's supposed to look like? Because neither of us knew, but like at least there was someone who was verifying that, yeah, it looks okay. Let's see what happens.
That's totally what I experienced as well. It was down to the fact that I was like, is it safe to put an emoji in here? Like, can I say smiley face? You know, is that done? Is that the norm? Because I'm a big one for emojis. But it was the nervousness about just things like tone that I don't think documentation really ever covers. So it's sometimes it's these small things that makes you gives you that comfort level to go ahead and make a contribution. And that's an important factor that perhaps I often don't see covered much in terms of, sometimes you need more than just the functional instructions.
100%. And like even in that contribution process, like my journey was also started kind of by a mentor in the community. I did not know the person before. I met him at one of the OpenStack events, and then he became my mentor kind of organically. And Owen's patience is also admirable, because yeah, I'm not sure if I would be where I am today if he didn't help me throughout the process of contributing and then becoming a core reviewer in the project and those kind of things. It's all because he helped me a lot. And I also did experience of being probably way more motivated to help others, just because my first experience was very nice, and you just feel that you got something and you have to kind of pay it back and share that with others. And I don't think I've done a that close mentoring than what he did with me, but in terms of like becoming a community manager, like I'm trying to do that payback and contribute back into the ecosystem by helping entire communities to make sure that they are successful in what they would like to achieve and sustainable. So and also like talking to others on the podcast, it definitely shows how much the first experience matters. It can set people back a lot, or it can really like skyrocket the process. Like the person just falls into it, and then there's no turning back from there.
I would love to hear more about InnerSource. And in particular, maybe for the audience, just to kind of give an overview as to what InnerSource is. What are the challenges, the common challenges that you see in organizations that are moving in that direction and trying to set up such a collaboration?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's really interesting because first of all, InnerSource, I would say, is like an evolving practice. So, it's not like there's an exhaustive 5-point list that I can tell you that's it. This is exactly it and no more. But I will say that there are many of. I mean, when I talk about the idea of using open source methods and practices, a lot of the times it starts with just the principles of openness. So it starts with organizations thinking about, well, is my code visible beyond the team that's working on it? Can other people find it? If they can find it, am I allowing them to create contributions to it? Is it documented well? Do I need a license, interestingly? Because you kind of think there's no need for an internal license, but sometimes there is in certain organizational structures. So some of the same, and then, what is the process for for other people to contribute to my project? Do I even want that to happen? So there's a lot of the same principles that you would assume in an open source community that you have to kind of double check well, where am I with that in my organization? What are my motivations and what is my goal around that? You would have many people in large corporations who are thinking about InnerSource, but not necessarily thinking about it as a company-wide initiative. They're looking at it for maybe a collaboration between a smaller number of kind of development partners, or they're trying it as a kind of a pilot first of all, before maybe rolling it out at a company level. So I would say that in terms of what it looks like, you know, when you think about the things you would expect in an open source project, you could list out a few of them, like the code is visible, you can modify it, you can share it without constraints, you can use it without constraints. Some of those things you just have to kind of run through and say, well, what would that look like for my project in this organization? I would say that the conversations can differ somewhat. So one of the things that I find interesting is that even when you kind of list off what would happen in an open source community, sometimes that conversation, when you take it within an organization and thinking about internal processes, can be slightly different. Sometimes it makes the conversation easier. So for example, if someone's doing you know, awareness or education around the fact that their project is available, well, they have a kind of a constrained audience that they're able to address, and sometimes there are even communication vehicles for them to say, "Hey, there's a new InnerSource project available. We're open for contributions," and they put it out on the internal, whatever, channels, communication channels, and they have a little party and they get some funding and they can have some events, and it's all very, you know, easy to do. Whereas, I mean, sometimes if you're in the open source community and you go, "Hey, I've got this open source project," tumbleweed. You know, so it's you know there's mechanisms that are available internally in organizations that make some of that easier, but then there are also processes inside internal organizations that make some things harder. So so when you think about even the culture that's around a particular project. So for example, if someone is creating an open source project, I mean, they have full autonomy over maybe what license they choose, you know, how they choose to document it, anything like that. But when you take that into an internal organization, sometimes there are company processes that one has to be aware of. You have to start thinking about, well, what is the open source policy of my organization? Do I have autonomy about what license I used? Can I choose how this will work? And how does it fit with the broader policies and processes that are always already in my organization? So in that context, then how it works might be constrained within an organization. Sometimes that's an individual's choice, and sometimes it has to be done within the context of the organizational structure, rules, norms, that sort of thing. If I think about, well, what is it that we see InnerSource Commons members talk a lot about? They will talk a lot about things like, you know, are my InnerSource projects discoverable? Is there some way within the organization for people to see what is made InnerSource or not? You'll hear them talk a lot about this idea of getting the permission to make the code visible or not. Is it visible by default as a policy within my organization, or do I have to have justification around that? And then there'd be a lot of talk about trying to break down some of those organizational constraints that may hamper the idea of collaboration. And sometimes that's as simple as, you know, just maybe middle management really not being aware of the potential for this and how budgets are allocated and how that might constrain whether collaboration is allowed to happen or not, whether you can pass code beyond organizational boundaries or not. So it's interesting. I think the principles at a high level are the same. The conversations can be very different in terms of enabling InnerSource versus enabling open source within an organization.
Right. And in my experience, I think the challenges, interestingly enough, can be very similar and maybe even possible to analyze more as a microcosm, in the sense of who pays for the reviewers of other people's code that you might contribute into this code base, and who's paying for maintaining that, because similar to open source projects, the developers that have written this code and have made it visible to others inside of the company, again, they're on a product deadline, and so they need to get stuff done. And if there is a contribution that is needed, and you know that other organization doesn't want to fork, they would like it all to be a same common base, then there's expense being done by the original authors because they have to review and bring that code in. So I see the same type of dynamics. I mean, have you seen that as well? And are there any silver bullets for getting that one fixed?
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget but bullet, but no, silver budget as well. Silver budget that is
that's
a silver
what you
bullet.
need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people are, I suppose, experimenting with this idea of actually having a budget that's specifically for, well-used InnerSource projects, and then they move into some sort of classification of core infrastructure that then gets some centralized budget support.
I think you should coin that phrase too. I think you should call it the silver budget and just get that one. Get that one trademarked.
But I do think the idea, so yes, the same challenges absolutely occur. However, I will say sometimes that the conversation becomes, sometimes it's a little bit easier to justify the spend on maintenance of a particular project, for example, because the organization knows that they own that code, right? So it's maybe a different conversation. We're saying I'm maintaining it for my millions of users out there in the ether, and you're like, look, and someone somewhere with a ROI spreadsheet is going, who now? Who's getting the benefit of this? Whereas certainly within the organizational boundaries, maybe that kind of ROI conversation can be a little easier, though it's still challenging, right? To prove reuse, to prove the value beyond from the creator's organization. But there are organizations who are looking at that and measuring the value and being able to quantify the reuse, for example. So there are organizations that we would have that as members of InnerSource Commons who would discuss a lot about that, about trying to measure the value. And sometimes it's in the context of things like transfer pricing and things like that. So even in terms of regulatory reporting around InnerSource and software reuse within organizational boundaries, that becomes an issue. Again, transfer pricing doesn't become an issue with open source, interestingly, because that was exempt from that kind of discussion. So that's another area where open source becomes easier. But the conversation around transfer pricing has sometimes forced organizations to quantify the value, which then lends itself to discussions around where budget should come from. So it's interesting that those dynamics are subtly different, but and sometimes extremely different. But they do. So same challenges, maybe different outcomes. And I think the patterns for how people manage that is something that certainly InnerSource Commons are very interested in gathering over time.
We are talking a lot about how to apply open source practices internally, but when it comes to quantifying values of any kind for organizations who maybe never thought of actually contributing back and really looking into a more involved open source journey, do you think that those practices that are coming from InnerSource and those internal conversations could be applied to open source? I mean, when we actually talk about, open sourcing a project or getting involved in an open source project.
I think it's interesting. I think there are some. I don't think that these methods or practices are even well established in the InnerSource world. So whereas there are some organizations who are experimenting with that idea of quantifying the value, I wouldn't say they're the majority. The majority of organizations are still at the same kind of place, maybe, that some of the open source value is being expressed. So they would be doing things like surveys to actually get perceived value. How developer satisfaction? They would be looking at this kind of qualitative data to try and show some of the value, because it is so hard to be able to accurately quantify that. And there have been, I suppose, the more recent reports in the open source world around looking at the economic value of software reuse. I know some of that was being, presented in Brussels around, in last February, where there were some of the new reports out by Frank Nagel and some of those researchers who are actually looking at this idea of actually quantifying value. I think the challenge, though, is that, in many respects, certainly in the open source world, there will always be the question of value to whom. Even if you can quantify the value of software that you've created in terms of its reuse elsewhere, that might be a different conversation internally than it would be externally. So if you use the same methods to quantify reuse internally in organization, all the value of that reuse goes back into the organization. Whereas if you take that same value external to the organization, it's not necessarily the case. Now, then you start moving into, well, what's the value of contributions back? But that's a different conversation, right? That's a different model in the open source ecosystem. So I think all of these patterns are incredibly interesting. I don't think we're, as an ecosystem, we're as mature as we might be in either the InnerSource world or the open source world to start being able to, you know, get down to a bottom line number. But I do think, I think it would be wrong to dismiss the qualitative feedback that we're getting for both the InnerSource movement and the open source movement in terms of what it's proven to do in terms of, for example, the perception of increased speed, productivity. And again, really hard to manage these things, right? But if developers are consistently saying, I think it makes us faster, I really like the networking opportunities and relationship building that we do, it helps me learn faster, it helps me, you know, scratch my own itch, and that makes me happier in my work. Like, we cannot dismiss that level of value either. And I think sometimes in the rush to do these economic model things, like we kind of pull away from this incredibly valuable feedback. I mean, there's not many things in the world that you can pull a lever and go, ooh, knowledge has increased. Ooh, developer satisfaction has increased. We don't have many of those levers in the tech industry. We do in the InnerSource and open source world. And so even as we're talking about value, I'd be thinking, well, maybe we need to start thinking, well, do we need to put all our focus on this kind of bottom line value number in order to justify budgets? Or do we need to get organizations thinking more about, how do I create more agile software development teams? How do I increase developer satisfaction? How do I reduce staff turnover? How do I increase staff mobility? Like, these are all the things that they say they want. So if we get to a point where we can draw correlations between both open source and InnerSource contributions, and those sort of factors, it might be even more valuable to organizations than having some sort of bottom line to say, well, I can buy it over here, or I can pay the money over here. And then you're like, well, you're still in a kind of a either or situation, but there's all this other value in the open source and InnerSource worlds.
I totally agree. And it kind of sounds like that maybe we should actually talk about these things a little bit more in both contexts, because I'm a person who always wants the qualitative data as well, the surveys, the experience, the actual feedback in terms of, is this actually working? However, the other side of conversations that we've been having, both on this podcast and just in general in the ecosystem, is just the usual struggle of, how do I convince anybody in my organization that we should go and contribute to this open source project XYZ that we usually already use or care about because it looks interesting and we should probably use it. And if you're a user, either from a vendor company or an operator, then it just becomes kind of somewhere in the organizational ladder, someone will at some point think about, maybe we should actually do this in the open source community as opposed to internally, because of all the maintenance cost, for instance, the risks of not contributing something back that's in the middle of the open source project, and those kind of questions. But I don't really see an equation that's flying around that, hey, put this here, this there, and then you get this, and then you have some ideas. So it all boils down to beliefs and becomes sometimes an almost religious conversation in my experience, in terms of, why we should actually contribute back. The word investment pops up in more and more conversations now when it comes to open source contributions, and also the other side of risks of, not doing it right or not doing it at all. That actually does have risk, and that does have cost associated to as well. But we haven't really, in my experience, talked about these things much in the past, or where the conversations happened, they weren't as open as they could have been, just so that we can all learn from each other. So I think that this kind of sounds like something that's a strong connection point between InnerSource and open source in terms of the organizational internal processes and decision making. Because when it comes to open source, that for contributing companies and organizations, that does have a huge internal component to it. There's no way around that. There are a lot of decisions that have to happen inside a company first, and then a lot of transformation process and all those kind of things. And at one point, that will all boil down to budget. I think it would be beneficial to be able to point people to some resources in terms of how to start figuring that out.
No, I would agree, and I'll add one more thing actually, which complicates matters, I think, in terms of the discussion. And it's sparked in my head when you mentioned this idea that sometimes it comes down to a principled or almost religious conversation about what we should do. And it's sometimes when you are talking about that value, I find one thing I've noted more recently is that sometimes the discussion about the cost of doing it can sometimes also not be realistic, right? So and even in terms of the effort and time involved in, if you are going to contribute to either open source or you're going to start embarking on InnerSource, there is a cost to collaboration. And oftentimes that cost is an upfront cost, and you may not see the benefits till sometime down the road. So not only in terms of the budget, but also in terms of the kind of temporal nature of when you see the return. That's something that I think is important to bring up as well. And so really, when we are talking about the fact that people make decisions on the back of whatever value proposition you're bringing forward, it's really important to set expectations as well, that these things don't come for free. Like, you don't just turn around and go, well, now I'm doing, like, I just tossed it over the wall and now I'm contributing to open source, and maintenance will be easy from now on because all those people out there will just maintain it for me. Like, obviously we know that doesn't happen. Neither does it happen in the InnerSource world. I'll toss it out into the internal intranet and everyone will suddenly start contribute. Like, doesn't work either. And so, but in people's enthusiasm to create a value proposition for the value of doing this, they sometimes stop. They don't talk about that initial cost as well of doing collaboration well. So I'm just going to put that in as a gotcha, because it comes back to bite you if you don't set up the right expectations about that either. Like, and I will say, in as much as it's a shortcut that's taken in the open source world, it's taken in the InnerSource world, things like documentation, things like setting up the processes to review first timer commits, like, these are not things that expert developers necessarily jump up and start, throwing their hands in the air going, I want to do that. So that cost can sometimes be significant, both in terms of the time, but also in terms of getting the right people to do it, and getting them to want to do it. So and then this idea of how long does it take to get the benefit? These are conversations that we all need to have in the open, because I think it would benefit us all to be a little bit more transparent about that with folks that are coming to these kind of decisions.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think there are a lot of misconceptions, probably both to InnerSource and open source, because when you talk about the maintenance cost, that upfront cost, people, product management don't always factor that in, or they associate cost to contribution, like it will cost me headcount to go and contribute to this open source or InnerSource project for that matter. However, I don't think they put a dollar or euro sign next to not contributing back and driving the project to the ground, which I did see in the past, because it becomes unmaintainable if you practically creating an internal fork. So deviate from the upstream version and then start adding things to it, and then you merge it together with how the upstream project has newer and newer releases and changes. And then at one point, you will not be able to merge. There will be features, functionality, whatever in the upstream code base that you will not be able to put in your internal version because it just deviated too much. I've seen this before happening, and the company started to do the same thing with another project. And I was like, hands up in the air and like waving like crazy, you know, like the train is coming towards you, like get off the track. And no, they were just running towards collision. That's because of the other misconception of we are saving money on not contributing back because that's headcount and delay in time and uncertainties and all those kind of things. And no one actually factors in the actual cost of maintaining a fork and how that cost goes up exponentially at one point. And I think that's the other side of misconceptions.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting one, and sometimes I think about the general trends in society more generally about thinking about sustainability, and I think about like it's really that conversation, isn't it? It's like, how do you make technology more sustainable? Like there is this notion that you buy it once and you're done. I mean, there used to be, I think, a notion by some people that you'd buy it or you build it and I'm done. Like we all know that that's not the case, and it's really about creating something that is easy to maintain and sustain within the organization, external to the organization. Getting those principles right can set you up for the future.
I'm curious, do you have a story, something where one of your community members came and it was a significant challenge, but they ultimately triumphed and, you know, it had an ultimately really good outcome?
Oh, we've loads of those. So we have in InnerSource Commons, one of the other things we're doing is just gathering people's experiences and trying to show where they're talking about their InnerSource experiences. And we've gathered over about like over 100 references where people are talking about why they're doing it and what their experiences have been, and we run regular surveys to think about what people are perceiving as the benefits. And I mean, one of the case studies I was particularly involved in was actually from Microsoft, and it was a really interesting one because Microsoft have and it was in no connection, but because I used to work there, but I do you know, I knew that Microsoft, and I've always known that Microsoft had been deploying and implementing InnerSource within their product development departments. But this was actually a case study with their consultancy, the folks that are doing consulting with customers. And I found it really interesting because it was this group of folks in Microsoft Consulting Services who were using InnerSource to put together the resources that they would bring to customers. And in the past, that had been always done from a top-down publication process. So it was kind of centralized. Best practices go up the chain, get put into the material and go down the chain and get spread out. And that took an awful long time. And this group of practitioners, purely from a community of practice, had come together saying, we can do this better. And they were like, from all over the world, they were saying, we are going to start contributing to the centralized resource using InnerSource practices, not code, but knowledge. And in doing so, they got to a point where they had a like I talked to people from all over the world, and there were junior and senior people, and they were all working together where there wasn't any, you know, and this is what I'm talking about in terms of the positive kind of status and relatedness kind of levers you can pull. These people were contributing, and it was breaking through barriers of this whole idea. And you may be familiar in having worked in large organizations as well. But the idea in Microsoft, there's kind of like there's Redmond, there's things that are happening in headquarters, and then there's everyone else. This broke through that. This was like people in the farthest away geographically from the central groups were able to contribute in the same way as anyone who is central to that organization. People who are junior were able to like get really enthusiastic and decide to contribute because they had some insight that they wanted to put in. It was all being reviewed in the way that you would any kind of open source or InnerSource project. So it was being, you know, curated as this input was coming in. But you should have heard how people were describing that experience, their experience of connectedness across the world, their experience of being able to contribute, like the purpose that gave them, like they were able to, you know, they might have just been hired and they were just going out to engage with customers, and their feedback was being perpetrated through to every other person in the organization because it was relevant. And that was such an amazing experience for those people. There were people who had gone out to customer sites, been asked a question, answered the question, thought this will be interesting for everyone. And, you know, within a day or two, that new fresh information was being pushed out to everyone, and everyone had the latest kind of conversation points across the world. I'll use that as an example to say, like, that wasn't even being mandated from the top down. That was a group, a community of practice who had come together to voluntarily bring that together. And I thought that was really powerful. It just shows you that in as much as we talk about organizational constraints, how much you can do when you bring together people who are really passionate about something, and what they can show the rest of the organization can happen when they're enabled to do that. So yeah, that was one of my favorite stories from recent times.
Before we depart, Claire, can you tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with tech, nothing to do with program management, or open source, or InnerSource? Some kind of a fun fact.
Well, a surprising fact that surprised me is that I suppose, I'll mention my dog. I'm a dog lover. I didn't even know I was a dog lover until COVID. We got a dog. I wouldn't have called myself a dog person. And now, like, you know, it's like, yes, my name is Claire. I'm married. I have 2 kids and a dog. So yeah, he's now been elevated into very much part of the family. And yeah, he's sitting here beside me, actually. I've been hoping he didn't bark during our interview, but yeah, there we go. I'm a dog lover. It surprised me. I never would have pegged myself as one, but there you go.
What captured you in having a dog?
That was my daughter's influence, actually. So she'd been campaigning for many years, and I'd been kind of, oh yeah, one day we'll get a dog. And I think then I broke over COVID because it was something that I think we all needed. And indeed we were rewarded for that choice. It was something that made the whole experience of lockdown much easier.
What kind of dog do you have?
He's a Westie. It's a very cute Westie called Archie. So yeah, it's West Highland Terrier.
That's adorable. So you didn't go for the something huge.
No. That's part of the positive experience. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'm a small dog person, but it's
I have to see. We have a Bernese Mountain Dog as well as a terrier mix, but
well,
yes. And
can you comment on that? Is there preference for one over the other, or are they both just brilliant bundles of joy in different sizes?
they're both wonderful in their own unique ways.
There you go.
But yeah, the Bernese Mountain Dog, you know, they are cart dogs to be bred. So
yeah.
they want to be next to you. They want to feel you know, your hand on them. They're very loving. They are very, they would be a lap dog if the 105 pounds could be supported. Exactly.
That's an unfortunate combination. I mean, wanting to be a lap dog and being not the size of a lap dog.
Yep, exactly. But no, just total sweetness.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for Season 2. We will talk about InnerSource, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget, but no, silver budget as well. Silver budget that is a
that's
silver
what you
bullet.
need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that I don't know if you